Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, I want to share with you a story about the kind of storm that strips a person down to their bones, and the unexpected stranger who changes the landscape of a life forever. It is a story of survival, of a winter that came too fast, and of a woman who found that even the strongest fortress needs a gate. If this story finds a place in your heart, I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let me take you to the high, razor-edge slopes of the Montana Territory. The year is 1885, and the wind here doesn't just blow, it hunts. On Sawtooth Ridge, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thwack of an axe-splitting pine. This was Mercy's world. At 35 years old, Mercy wasn't a woman who waited for things to happen. She was the kind of woman who saw to it that they didn't. She lived alone in a cabin built of timber and stubbornness, perched on a granite shelf overlooking the valley floor. To the people in town, she was the widow on the ridge, a figure of pity, perhaps. But if you watched her this morning, moving between the smokehouse and the barn, you would see no pity in her stride. You would see capability. You would see a woman checking the latches on the heavy oak doors, ensuring the curing ham was high enough to miss the rats, and murmuring low, steady words to Bess, her bay mare, who was stamping nervously in her stall. Mercy valued her peace, the way a miser values gold. She had eyes that were the color of the slate sky, eyes that, as the saying goes, had seen enough of the world to prefer the horizon empty. But the horizon wasn't empty today. The air had changed since dawn. It had grown sharp, tasting of iron and coming snow. The locals called it a white eater, a storm that swallowed the world whole. Mercy wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out to secure the perimeter one last time. She scanned the tree line, her gaze practiced and sharp. That's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow detaching itself from the pines. But shadows don't shiver. Standing dangerously close to the canyon drop-off was a horse. It was saddled, its reins trailing in the frost-bitten grass, its coat matted with sweat that was quickly turning to ice. A riderless horse on a ridge like this meant only one thing: trouble. And trouble was the one guest Mercy never invited in. She didn't call out. She didn't run back inside to bolt the door. She assessed. She watched the animal for a long moment, looking for the sway of a rider in the grass, or the glint of a rifle barrel. Nothing. Just the wind hissing through the dead sage. Mercy returned to the porch, but not to hide. She reached just inside the door and pulled down her heavy wool coat and the double-barreled shotgun she kept loaded with buckshot. She approached the horse slowly. "Easy now," she soothed, her voice low and grounded. The horse rolled its eyes, wild with fear, but let her take the reins. That's when she saw the drag marks, deep furrows in the half-frozen mud, leading away from the trail and over the lip of the ravine. Mercy tied the horse to a scrub oak and moved to the edge. The drop was steep, a tumble of shale and scree that ended in a cluster of boulders 50 feet down. And there, twisted amongst the rocks, was the wreckage of a wagon. It wasn't a settler's wagon. It was a cage on wheels. The wood splintered and the iron bars bent. The driver lay in the brush a few yards away, unnaturally still, covered by a dusting of fresh snow. But there was movement near the wheel. A man was there. He was massive, built like a cliff face, slumped against the shattered axle. He wasn't moving much, but he was alive. Mercy could see the rise and fall of his chest, labored, and shallow. He was dressed in a thin shirt that was soaked through, dark blood staining his side. Where a bullet had grazed the ribs, Mercy squinted against the biting wind. This man wasn't just trapped by the wreckage. His left wrist was encased in iron, a heavy handcuff linked to the spoke of the wagon wheel. He was a prisoner, a dangerous man. Perhaps a killer, a thief. The law didn't put men in cages for singing too loud in church. Fear pricked at the back of Mercy's neck. A cold warning. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to turn around, to ride into town and tell the sheriff. But looking at the sky, watching the clouds bruise into a deep, violent purple, she knew the truth. By the time she got back, the White Eater would have claimed him. He would be a frozen statue by morning. Mercy looked at the storm, then down at the man. She tightened her grip on the shotgun. She didn't know who this Gideon was, but she knew she couldn't leave a dog to die like that, let alone a man. With a sigh that was lost to the wind, she began to climb down. The ravine was a throat of ice, and they were swallowed deep inside it. Mercy scrambled down the last few feet of shale, the loose rock clattering like skeletal fingerbones into the brush. When she reached the wreckage, the smell hit her first, not the scent of pine or snow, but the copper tang of fresh blood and the sour musk of fear from the dead driver. She didn't look at the body in the brush. She couldn't afford to. Her eyes were fixed on the man chained to the wheel, Gideon, up close. He was even larger than he had appeared from the ridge. He was a mountain of a man, slumped awkwardly against the shattered oak spokes. His coat was soaked through, dark with melted sleet, and the darker stain of blood seeping from his side. He was shivering so violently that the handcuffs rattled against the iron rim of the wheel, a frantic, metallic chattering that was the only sound against the rising wind. Mercy knelt in the mud, her knees instantly soaking through her wool skirt. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice sharp. He groaned, his head lolling back, but his eyes didn't open. He was deep in the feverlands, somewhere between consciousness and the cold. She grabbed the chain of the handcuffs. It was heavy, lawman-grade steel. She tugged at it, but it was looped tight around the axle. She checked his pockets for a key, her hands moving quickly, impersonally, over his wet clothes. Nothing. The driver must have had it. And the driver was buried under a drift of snow 10 yards away. There was no time to dig. The wind howled, a high, thin shriek that signaled the true start of the White Eater. The first hard pellets of snow began to sting Mercy's cheeks. "All right," she muttered to herself, the words snatched away by the gale. "We do this the hard way." She reached into her hair, her fingers numb and clumsy, and pulled out a long, thick hairpin made of stiff iron wire. It was a simple thing, something she used to keep her heavy braid off her neck while she churned butter or chopped wood. Now, it was the only thing standing between this stranger and a frozen grave. Mercy leaned in close. She could feel the heat radiating off him, a burning, unnatural fever that contrasted with the biting cold of the steel cuff. She jammed the wire into the locking mechanism. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the cold that was already gnawing at her dexterity. Click, scrape. The lock was stubborn. Grit and ice, already working their way into the tumblers. "Come on," she hissed through gritted teeth. She twisted the wire, feeling it bend. "Don't you break on me. Not today." She forced herself to breathe, to find that center of calm she went to when a mare was foaling or when the winter nights got too long and too quiet. She visualized the mechanism inside. She felt for the tension. Click. The sound was small, but it rang like a church bell in the canyon. The cuff sprang open. Gideon slumped forward, released from his anchor, his heavy weight falling squarely against Mercy. She grunted, bracing herself, her boots sliding in the slush. He was dead weight, dense with muscle and bone. Up, she commanded, grabbing him by the lapels of his coat. You don't get to die down here. I won't haul a carcass up that hill. Somehow, through the haze of pain, he heard her. Or perhaps it was just instinct, the animal drive to survive. Gideon groaned and forced his legs to work. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily on her. He was a head taller than she was, broad as a barn door, and she felt small beside him. But Mercy was made of the same granite as the ridge. They began the climb. It was a nightmare of slipping boots and gasping breaths. Every step was a battle. The snow was falling in earnest now, a white curtain dropping over the world, erasing the horizon, erasing the trail. Mercy didn't look up. She just looked at her boots. Step, drag. Step, drag. By the time they crested the ridge, the world had turned white. The cabin was just a dark smudge in the swirling snow. But the chimney was breathing a thin line of gray smoke, a promise of life. They stumbled across the yard. Mercy kicked the door open, and they collapsed inside. The change was instant. The roar of the wind was cut off as Mercy slammed the heavy oak door, and through the iron bolt, the world of blue ice and screaming wind vanished, replaced by the amber glow of the hearth. The cabin was warm, smelling of dried sage, wood smoke, and the yeasty scent of the bread she had set to rise that morning. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. Talk, talk, talk. Mercy let Gideon slide down to the floorboards near the rug. He was out cold again, his energy spent on the climb. She didn't rest. She stripped off her wet coat, throwing it on the peg. Then she turned her attention to him. This was work she knew. Mercy had been a wife, and before that, she had helped the doctor in town when the influenza came through. She looked at Gideon, not as a man, but as a problem to be solved. A machine that was broken. Let's see what the winter tried to take, she whispered. His clothes were frozen to him. She didn't bother with buttons. Her fingers were still too stiff, and the fabric was like board. She took her shears from the sewing basket and cut the coat away, peeling the layers of sodden wool and linen from his chest. As the clothes fell away, Mercy paused. He was built like a cliff face, sheer and hard, corded with muscle that spoke of a life of hard labor. But it was the map written on his skin that held her gaze. There were scars, old ones, a jagged white line running across his collarbone, a star-shaped pucker of skin on his shoulder that looked like an old arrow wound, and across his back, faint but visible in the firelight, were the thin, silvery tracks of a whip. Years healed but never forgotten. This was a man who had walked through violence to get here. But Mercy didn't flinch. She had her own scars, even if hers were on the inside, where they didn't show. She turned her attention to the fresh wound. A bullet had grazed his lower ribs on the left side. It wasn't deep, but it was ugly torn flesh, and dark, oozing blood. She moved, with efficient, practiced grace. She fetched a basin of warm water from the kettle on the stove, a clean cloth, and a bottle of corn whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. She bathed the wound, her hands steady. The water in the basin turned pink, then red. She poured a splash of whiskey over the raw skin. Gideon's body jerked, a reflex of pain even in his unconsciousness, his hand flinching as if to grab a weapon that wasn't there. "Easy," she murmured, placing a cool hand on his fevered forehead. "The burning means you're still alive." She bandaged him tight with strips of clean linen, wrapping his ribs to hold the flesh together. She pulled a quilt from the bed, the one she had stitched herself during the long winter of '82, and tucked it around him. She sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on a rag. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving a tremble in her limbs. She watched him breathe. The rise and fall of his chest was hitching, but stronger than before. She stirred the fire, adding a log of seasoned oak. The sparks flew up the chimney, bright orange stars in the dim room. Outside, the wind battered the walls, shaking the window frames, demanding entry. But the cabin held. An hour passed, then two. Mercy sat in her rocking chair, the shotgun across her lap, watching the stranger. Then, the rhythm of his breathing changed. Gideon shifted. His eyes snapped open. They weren't the hazy, fevered eyes of the man in the ravine. These were clear, dark, and sharp with sudden awareness. He didn't groan. He didn't ask where he was. He went instantly rigid, his muscles coiling. He tried to sit up, his hand grasping at his hip for a holster that Mercy had already hung on the hook by the door. The movement tore at his side, and he hissed in pain, falling back against the floorboards. "Easy," Mercy said from the shadows of the room. "You've lost blood. You move too fast. You'll start it flowing again." Gideon's head whipped toward her voice. He saw the woman in the rocking chair, the firelight catching the gray in her braid, and the steel of the shotgun barrel on her knees. He looked around the room, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the clean floor, the bolt on the door. He looked down at his bandaged chest, then back at her. The panic in his eyes settled into a grim, weary resignation. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You shouldn't have brought me in, ma'am," he rasped. His voice was like grinding gravel, deep and unused. "Trouble follows my tracks, and it doesn't stop for snow." Mercy stopped rocking. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the scars, the handcuffs she had thrown on the table, and the haunted look of a man who expects the world to hurt him. She stood up and walked to the window, peering out through the crack in the shutters at the white void swirling outside. "The storm is the only trouble that matters tonight," she said, her voice calm and absolute. She turned back to face him, her silhouette framed by the dying light of the day. "You step out there, you die. The cold doesn't care about your past. And neither do I. Not tonight." She walked to the stove and poured a cup of coffee. The steam, rising in a curling ribbon, she set it on the floor within his reach. "Drink," she ordered gently. "I didn't drag you up that hill just to bury you tomorrow." For the next 48 hours, the world ceased to exist. There was no Sawtooth Ridge, no valley, no town of jagged rooftops and smoking chimneys. There was only the white, screaming void of the storm outside, and the small, amber-lit circle of the cabin inside. The white eater had come, burying the windows in drifts that reached the eaves, sealing Mercy and Gideon into a forced, intimate silence. Time became a fluid thing, measured not by the clock on the mantel, but by the logs fed to the fire and the slow, rhythmic deepening of the snow against the door. In that small space, There was nowhere to hide. Gideon spent the first day fighting the fever. He drifted in and out of a restless sleep, his body fighting the infection with the same stubborn ferocity he likely applied to everything else. Mercy kept her distance. But she was never far. She was a constant orbit around him, changing his bandages, forcing bitter willow bark tea between his cracked lips, stoking the fire until the iron stove ticked with heat. By the second morning, the fever broke. The heat left his skin, leaving him pale and weak, but clear-headed, and that is when the dynamic shifted. Gideon was a man used to being the protector, the hunter, the one who stood between the innocent and the dark. To be the one in the chair, the one wrapped in a quilt, while a woman chopped kindling on the hearth, clearly sat ill with him. He watched her. He watched her with the intensity of a hawk on a fence post. Mercy could feel his eyes on her as she moved about the cabin. It wasn't a predatory gaze. She knew what that looked like, having fended off enough drunken drifters in town. No, this was something else. It was a look of profound confusion, mixed with a growing, grudging wonder. She was standing at the heavy pine table, kneading dough for biscuits. Her hands were flour-dusted, strong and sure, working the rhythm of the bread. Push, turn, fold, push, turn, fold. It was a mesmerizing, domestic sound in the middle of a natural disaster. Gideon shifted in the rocking chair, wincing as his ribs protested. He held the mug of coffee she'd given him with both hands, letting the warmth seep into his calluses. "You live out here alone," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement he was trying to reconcile with reality. Miles from a neighbor. No dog. Just you and that scattergun. Mercy didn't stop kneading. She didn't look up. "I have a mare in the barn who listens better than most men," she said dryly. "And the silence up here, it doesn't ask for much. It asks for grit." Gideon rumbled. His voice was stronger today, the gravel smoothing out into a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Most folks, men included, would have packed up and run to the valley when the first snow flew. But you bolt the door and bake bread. Mercy paused then. She wiped a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She turned to look at him, her gray eyes cool and unreadable. "Panic burns energy," she said simply. "I don't have energy to waste." Gideon held her gaze for a long moment. The silence between them stretched. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with the crackle of the fire and the howling wind. And something new, a spark of recognition. "I've known a lot of brave men," Gideon said softly, almost to himself. "Marshals, soldiers, fools with badges. But I've never known a woman who looked at a storm and didn't blink." Mercy felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the stove. She turned back to her dough, attacking it with renewed vigor. "Eat your biscuits, Gideon. Flattery won't heal your ribs." But the bridge had been built. Later that evening, as the storm raged with renewed fury, shaking the very timbers of the roof, the truth finally came out. They had finished a simple meal of salt pork and beans. The lantern light was low, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Gideon sat a little straighter, his face grim. "You need to know what you've let into your house," he said. The playfulness was gone. The hardness was back. Mercy sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "I figured you weren't a horse thief. You didn't run when I took the cuffs off." "I'm a U.S. Marshal," Gideon said. "Or I was. Until 3 days ago." He told her the story. his voice low and steady. He spoke of a judge in the valley, Judge Thorn, a man who owned the land, the water rights, and the law. Gideon had been sent from the capital to serve a warrant for corruption and murder. He had the papers in his saddlebags, but Thorn knew I was coming. Gideon said, staring into the fire. The men who hit the wagon, they weren't bandits. They were deputies. Men with badges paid for by Thorn's silver. They killed the driver. They were taking me up the canyon to make me disappear. If that wheel hadn't broken, he trailed off. Mercy understood. The canyon was deep. A body thrown down there wouldn't be found until the spring thaw. If ever. So the law is hunting you. Mercy said quietly. The law has turned. Gideon corrected. And now, because you pulled me out of that wreck, it'll turn on you. 2. Thorn doesn't leave loose ends. He looked at her then, expecting fear, expecting her to tell him to leave, to get out, to spare her. Instead, Mercy stood up and walked to the mantel. She picked up a small, framed tin-type photograph. It was old, the image fading. A man with a kind smile stood next to a younger Mercy. This was Silas, she said. Gideon watched her. He pass in the war. No, Mercy said. The fever. 5 years ago. It swept through the valley like a fire. He was a strong man. Silas. Stronger than you. Maybe. He could lift a wagon axle by himself. But the fever, it didn't care about his strength. It burned him out in 3 days. She ran a thumb over the frame. Her face soft but dry-eyed. When he died, everyone told me to sell. They said a woman couldn't hold Sawtooth Ridge alone. They said the winter would break me. She set the picture down with a decisive clack. I stayed. I learned to fix the roof. I learned to shoot that shotgun. I learned that the only thing that can truly break you is giving up. She turned to Gideon. You say the law has turned on you. You say bad men are coming. Well, let them come. I didn't survive the fever and the silence and the loneliness just to be scared off by a corrupt judge and his hired hands. Gideon stared at her. In the dim light, he saw more than just a widow. He saw a fortress. And for the first time in a long time, the solitary, hunted Marshal felt something he hadn't expected. He felt safe. You're a hard woman to argue with, Mercy, he murmured, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. I'm a hard woman to kill, she replied. There's a difference. The storm broke on the morning of the 3rd day. It didn't taper off. It simply stopped, as if the sky had run out of breath. One moment, the wind was shrieking. The next, there was a silence so profound it rang in the ears. Mercy opened the door. The world had been remade. The ridge was a pristine, blinding expanse of white, glittering under a hard, cold sun. The pines were bowed heavy under the weight of the snow. It was beautiful, but Gideon didn't look at the beauty. He limped to the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame, his eyes scanning the tree line, the valley road, the shadows of the rocks. His body was tense, coiled tight as a spring. The peace of the last 2 days evaporated like mist. It's quiet, Mercy noted, breathing in the sharp, freezing air. Too quiet, Gideon said. His hand went instinctively to his hip, searching for the gun that was now tucked into his belt. The storm was covering our tracks. It was keeping them down in the valley. But now, he pointed to the horizon, where a thin wisp of darkness was moving against the white snow. Too steady to be a cloud, too organized to be a pack of wolves. They won't wait for the thaw, Gideon said, his voice cold. They're coming. Mercy stepped back inside and reached for the shotgun above the door. She checked the breech, the twin shells sliding home with a satisfying metallic clack. Then we'd best get the coffee on, she said, her voice steady as the stone beneath her feet. It's going to be a long day. The sun was high now. A cold, indifferent coin in the pale sky. It threw no warmth, only a glaring, blinding light that reflected off the white expanse of the ridge. Mercy saw them first. She had been standing by the window, ostensibly checking the frost accumulation, but her hand was already resting near the stock of the shotgun leaning against the wall. "Riders," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of surprise. Gideon was sitting at the table, cleaning his revolver, the heavy Colt Peacemaker that Mercy had retrieved from his holster days ago. He didn't jump. He didn't scramble. He simply stopped moving. The oil rag stilled in his hand. "How many?" he asked. "3," Mercy replied, her eyes narrowing against the glare. "Coming up the switchback. They're moving slow. Heavy horses." Gideon forced himself up. The pain in his side was a dull, constant roar. But he pushed it down, locking it away in a box in his mind. He limped to the window, staying back in the shadows so as not to be seen. He looked out. 3 figures on horseback were picking their way through the drifts. They wore long duster coats against the chill, their hats pulled low. They didn't look like the rough, desperate outlaws that usually drifted through the territory. Their saddles were too clean, their horses too well fed. And then, as the lead rider shifted in his saddle, the sun caught a flash of metal on his chest. A star. "Deputies." Gideon breathed, the word tasting like ash. "It's Kincaid, the tall one. He's Thorne's right hand. A man who'd shoot his own mother for a gold eagle." He turned to Mercy. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were pleading. "Mercy, listen to me. They want me. If I walk out there, if I surrender, they might just take me and ride on. They have no quarrel with you." Mercy looked at him. She looked at the bandages she had changed that morning. She looked at the man who had sat by her fire and listened to the story of her dead husband with respect in his eyes. "You walk out there, and they put a bullet in your back before you clear the porch steps," she said. "And then they burn this house down to hide the evidence. You said it yourself. Thorne leaves no loose ends. And now, I'm a loose end." She picked up the double-barreled shotgun. It was an old weapon, the wood smooth from use, but the mechanism was well-oiled. She broke it open, checking the brass shells, then snapped it shut with a sound that signaled the end of the discussion. "This is my land," she said, "and I don't open my door to wolves, no matter what kind of badge they wear." Outside, the crunch of hooves on snow stopped. "Hello, the house?" a voice called out. It was smooth, confident, carrying easily over the wind. Mercy moved to the door. She motioned Gideon to the side, out of the line of fire. She unbolted the heavy oak door and pulled it open, but she left the sturdy wire mesh screen door latched tight. It was a thin barrier, but it was a barrier. She stepped into the frame, wiping her hands on her apron, adopting the posture of a woman interrupted from her chores. She didn't raise the shotgun yet. She kept it hidden behind the fold of her skirt. The lead rider, Kincaid, nudged his horse forward. He was a handsome man in a sharp, dangerous way, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. Mighty cold weather to be up here all alone. I like the cold, Mercy said. Keeps the pests away. What do you want? Kincaid chuckled. A dry sound. Direct. I like that. We're looking for a fugitive. Ma'am. A dangerous man. Escaped custody down in the canyon a few days back. Big fellow. Ugly scar on his shoulder. Goes by the name of Gideon. Mercy frowned. Playing the part. The storm blew for 3 days. Deputy. I haven't seen a soul. Living or dead. Just the wind. Kincaid's eyes drifted over the cabin, noting the fresh tracks in the yard. The smoke from the chimney. Is that so? Well, you wouldn't mind if we came inside and warmed our hands then? Just to be sure, he hasn't crept into your barn without you knowing. I would mind, Mercy said. Her voice hardened, losing the ignorant widow tremor. I'm a woman alone, and I don't invite strange men into my home. Badge or no badge, Kincaid's smile vanished. The pretense dropped like a stone. Now listen here, he snapped. We know he's in there. We found the wagon. We saw the tracks leading up the ridge. Send him out, and we'll ride away. You have the word of the law. The law, Mercy scoffed. If you were the law, you'd have a warrant signed by a judge. Not just threats and guns. Do you have a paper? Deputy. Kincaid stared at her. He hadn't expected this. He had expected fear. He had expected compliance. He hadn't expected a schoolteacher's lecture on jurisprudence from a ranch widow. I am the warrant. Kincaid spat. He nodded to the man on his left. The deputy raised a rifle. Get down. Gideon roared from the shadows. Mercy threw herself to the floor just as the rifle cracked. The bullet tore through the screen door, splintering the doorframe where her head had been a second before. Gideon didn't hesitate. He swung out from the wall, leveling the Colt. He was weak, his hands trembling with the effort. But his aim was true. He fired once. The deputy, who had fired, yelped, clutching his shoulder as his horse reared, spinning in the snow. Back, pull back, Kincaid yelled, wheeling his mount around. They retreated behind the cover of the woodpile and the thick trunk of an old ponderosa pine. Silence fell over the ridge again, but this time it was heavy, vibrating with violence. Inside, Mercy scrambled to her feet. She wasn't shaking. She was angry. A cold, clear anger that sharpened her vision. Are you hit? Gideon asked, crawling toward her. No, she said. She peeked out the window. They're behind the woodpile. They're pinned down. Not for long. Gideon grimaced, reloading the spent chamber. They have rifles. We have a shotgun and a pistol. They can pick us apart from a distance. They won't wait for that, Mercy said. They're cold. They're impatient. As if on cue, a flicker of light appeared behind the woodpile. Fire, Gideon whispered. One of the deputies broke cover, sprinting toward the porch. In his hand was a bottle, the rag stuffed in the neck blazing with orange flame. A Molotov cocktail of kerosene and hate. Gideon tried to track him, but his injury slowed him. He fired, the bullet kicking up snow at the man's heels. But he missed. The deputy hurled the bottle. It smashed against the wooden planks of the porch, right beneath the window. Whoosh! The flames roared up, hungry and bright. The scent of burning pine oil and kerosene flooded the cabin instantly. Burn them out, Kincaid's voice echoed from the trees. Let's see how long they hold their breath. The fire was climbing the wall. The smoke began to curl under the door, gray and choking. We have to move, Mercy coughed. The porch is dry timber. It'll go up like tinder. She grabbed a bucket of water from the kitchen bench. But Gideon stopped her. No, he said. You open that door to throw water. And they'll cut you down. They're waiting for it. He was right. They were trapped. The heat was already radiating through the logs. But Mercy didn't freeze. She looked at the floorboards. She looked at the rug in the center of the room. The root cellar, she said. Gideon looked at her, confused. A hole in the ground. That's a grave. Mercy. The smoke will fill it. Not this one, she said, her eyes fierce. My husband built it. It has an air vent that runs out through the stone foundation on the north side. And it has a service hatch. She dragged the heavy rug aside. There, cut into the floorboards, was a trap door with an iron ring. A service hatch, Gideon asked, helping her pull it open. It opens out under the back deck. Mercy explained quickly. We used it to load potatoes in without tracking mud through the house. It comes out on the blind side of the cabin, the side facing the cliff. Gideon looked at the trapdoor, then at the flames licking the window glass. He looked at Mercy, this woman who knew every inch of her fortress, who had turned her home into a weapon. You're the strategist, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. Lead the way. Mercy dropped into the darkness of the cellar. Give me the shotgun, she said. Gideon handed it down, then slid into the hole after her. He pulled the trapdoor shut above them, plunging them into darkness. Above their heads, they could hear the crackle of the fire and the heavy boots of the deputies stepping onto the porch. Thinking they had won, thinking the rats were trapped in the burning trap, but down in the cool earth, amidst the smell of potatoes and damp soil, Mercy and Gideon were moving. They weren't hiding. They were flanking. They crawled toward the service hatch, toward the cold air, and toward the fight that would decide whether they lived to see the sunset. The air in the root cellar was damp and smelled of earth, a sharp contrast to the heat radiating through the floorboards above. Mercy pushed the service hatch open. It groaned, a low protest of rusted hinges, before swinging wide into the snow-choked darkness under the rear deck. The cold air rushed in, biting and clean. Go, Gideon whispered, his hand gripping her shoulder for a fleeting second. I'll draw them to the front. Mercy didn't waste words. She scrambled out into the drifts, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She was no longer the widow baking bread. She was the creature of the ridge, moving through her own territory. Above her, the front door of the cabin shattered. The sound was like a cannon-shot boot leather meeting scorched oak. Kincaid and his men were done waiting. Inside the cabin, the room was a hellscape of swirling gray smoke and orange embers. Gideon didn't try to stand. He stayed low, near the trapdoor, half hidden by the heavy dining table. As the first shadow fell across the threshold, the deputy who had thrown the fire, Gideon squeezed the trigger of the Colt. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The deputy crumpled, clutching his leg, his rifle skittering across the floorboards. But Kincaid was behind him. The tall lawman moved with the fluid, deadly grace of a snake. He didn't fire blindly. He stepped over his fallen man, kicking the table aside, his revolver leveled at Gideon's chest. You're a hard man to kill, Gideon. Kincaid coughed, his eyes watering from the smoke. But I've always enjoyed a challenge. Outside, Mercy rounded the corner of the cabin. The wind whipped her hair across her face. But her eyes were locked on the third man, the one who had been wounded in the shoulder earlier. He was crouched by the woodpile, fumbling to reload his rifle. his eyes fixed on the burning porch. He didn't see her, but he was standing right where she needed him. Mercy didn't raise her shotgun. Instead, she reached for a heavy length of rope tied to a stake near the foundation, the trigger mechanism for the deadfall trap she had rigged years ago to keep bears away from her winter fuel supply. She yanked the rope with all her strength. At the top of the woodpile, a massive, suspended log, weighted with stones, broke free. It crashed down with the force of a falling tree, slamming into the snow and the loose timber right beside the deputy. It didn't hit him directly, but the explosion of wood and snow sent him flying backward, knocking him cold against the frozen earth. 2 down. Inside, the situation was dire. Gideon was backed against the hearth, his gun hand trembling from blood loss. Kincaid stood over him, a cruel smile cutting through the haze of smoke. "Thorne sends his regards," Kincaid said, cocking the hammer of his pistol. The click was loud. Final. "Any last words?" "Marshal." Gideon looked up, his eyes hard. He wasn't looking at Kincaid. He was looking past him. The back door, the one leading to the kitchen, creaked open. It wasn't a violent entrance. It was a ghost's entrance. The wind swirled in, carving a tunnel through the smoke, carrying the scent of ice and pine. Kincaid sensed the shift in the air. The temperature dropped. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He began to turn, his gun drifting away from Gideon's chest. Mercy stepped out of the shadows. She stood framed by the storm, the double-barreled shotgun leveled steadily at Kincaid's heart. She didn't look frantic. She didn't look scared. She looked like Judgment Day. "I told you," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "This is my home." Kincaid froze. For a split second, he hesitated, his arrogance warring with the undeniable reality of the 12-gauge staring him down. His eyes flicked to Mercy, his finger twitching on the trigger. That hesitation was all Gideon needed. With a roar that scraped the bottom of his lungs, Gideon lunged upward. He didn't go for his gun. He went for Kincaid's. He slapped the barrel aside just as it went off. The bullet, burying itself harmlessly in the mantle, Gideon drove his shoulder into Kincaid's midsection, tackling him to the floor. The 2 men crashed into the furniture, a tangle of limbs and grit. But Gideon, fueled by desperation and the sight of Mercy standing her ground, found a reserve of strength. He jammed his forearm against Kincaid's throat, putting his entire weight behind it. Kincaid struggled, thrashing, but the fight drained out of him as the air was cut off. His eyes rolled back. His hand went limp. Gideon slumped forward, gasping for air, his forehead resting against the floorboards. The cabin fell silent, save for the crackle of the flames on the porch and the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 survivors. Mercy lowered the shotgun. She crossed the room, grabbing the bucket of water she had abandoned earlier, and threw it onto the burning windowsill. Steam hissed, angry and white, but the fire hissed out. She walked over to Gideon and dropped to her knees. She didn't say a word. She just placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the life still thrumming beneath the blood and the bandages. He looked up at her, his face streaked with soot and sweat. And in that look, amidst the wreckage of her home, there was no longer a stranger. There was only the man who had fought for her, and the woman who had saved him. They were breathless, battered, and bleeding, but they were alive. The thaw came slowly to Sawtooth Ridge, arriving not with a shout, but with the steady, dripping rhythm of melting ice. In the days that followed the siege, the cabin was a hive of quiet industry. The smell of smoke and fear was scrubbed away with lye soap and fresh mountain air. Mercy and Gideon worked side by side to repair the shattered door and replace the scorched planks on the porch. There was a difference in the silence between them now. It wasn't the wary silence of strangers, nor the tense silence of the hunted. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of two people who had stood in the fire together and come out the other side. They moved around one another with an easy familiarity. He reached for the hammer before she asked for it. She poured his coffee before he sat down. Kincaid and his surviving deputy were bound and locked in the root cellar. The very trap that had saved Mercy and Gideon was now their prison. They would face the real law in the capital. And this time, the evidence would ride with them. A week later, the snow had receded enough to reveal the muddy, scarred earth of the trail. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue. It was time. Gideon stood by the corral gate, tightening the cinch on his saddle. His side still pained him. Mercy could tell by the way he moved. Stiff and careful, but he was healed enough to ride. He had a duty to finish. He had to deliver the men who had betrayed the badge. And he had to clear his name. Mercy stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. She wasn't wearing her apron today. She was watching him. He led the horses out his own, and the string of mounts carrying the prisoners. He stopped at the gate and turned back to look at her. He didn't take his hat off. He didn't offer grand promises of a white picket fence or a life of ease. That wasn't who they were. They were people of the high country, where promises were made in blood and kept in iron. He walked up the steps, stopping just a breath away from her. He looked at the cabin, patched and standing strong. He looked at the horizon. And then he looked at her. "I have to go," he said, his voice low. "I know," Mercy replied. She didn't look away. Gideon shifted his weight, searching for the words. "Once I get these men to the capital, once the testimony is given, the road will be open. The road is always open, Gideon," she said softly. "The question is where you point your horse." He smiled then, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his dark eyes. He reached out, his rough, scarred hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the railing. "A man could spend a lifetime looking for a place like this," he said, his gaze sweeping over the ridge before returning to hold hers. "And a woman like you," Mercy felt the warmth of his hand, a tether pulling tight in her chest. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, just an inch. "Then don't take a lifetime to find your way back," she whispered. Gideon nodded once. A solemn vow. He turned, mounted his horse, and signaled the prisoners to move out. Mercy didn't go back inside. She didn't turn to her chores or her ledgers. She stood on the porch of her fortress, watching the small caravan wend its way down the switchbacks. She watched until they were nothing more than specks against the melting snow, until they disappeared behind the pines. For 5 years, Mercy had stood on this ridge and looked at the horizon, seeing only the past, seeing what she had lost. But today, as the sun climbed higher and the icicles wept their last tears into the mud, she saw something else. She saw a future, and she knew, with the certainty of the seasons, that winter eventually ends. And so, my friends, we leave Mercy there, no longer just surviving the cold, but waiting for the spring. Winter breaks many things: branches, roofs, sometimes even spirits. But it also reveals what is strong enough to last. It strips away the unnecessary, leaving only the truth. And on Sawtooth Ridge. The truth was simple: love, like the land itself, is worth fighting for. Thank you for walking this trail with me today and listening all the way to the end. I would love to hear your thoughts on Gideon and Mercy. Do you think he made it back before the first wildflowers bloomed? And tell me, where are you listening from today? It always warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. If this story brought a little warmth to your day, please give the video a like. It truly helps the channel grow, and share it with a friend who appreciates the spirit of the West. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Eagle Eye Apache and ring that bell so you never miss a journey into the wild. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and stay safe out there.